It is my pleasure to always join CMU's Energy Week. I think this is probably at least my third or fourth visit, and certainly every year it's a great conversation. And I certainly appreciated Jim's comments earlier. And so today I wanted to it's going to dovetail right off of Jim's comments and lead into the next speaker, a colleague of mine from the Department of Energy, but give you a perspective from the National Energy Technology Laboratory. And as I share my screen now, we will move into the specifics of what the way we're approaching from NETL, the pathway to decarbonization. I'm going to talk a lot about pathways. And so, we all have a shared vision, a shared goal, whether the timeline or the metrics along decarbonization might change from organization to organization. It is how we're going to decarbonize our economy. And so as we look at it from NETL's perspective, we certainly have a unique view as one of the U.S. Department of Energy National Labs. We're one of 17 labs, if you're not familiar with the DOE lab system, 17 labs spanning the Office of Science. You can see in the circles there are 10 Office of Science laboratories. Many of you may be familiar with the user facilities that are housed at these Office of Science labs, the big particle accelerators and light sources. The NNSA labs that manage and steward our nuclear arsenal in the U.S., but also providing key science and engineering into the energy system as well, environmental management, and then there are the three applied national labs: the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, stewarded by EERE, that we'll hear from next in Golden, Colorado, the Idaho National Laboratory, which focuses on nuclear energy, as per the last question in the last talk. And then we are the National Energy Technology Laboratory. You see we have three sites, one in Pittsburgh, one in Morgantown, West Virginia, one laboratory site in Albany, Oregon, and then two field sites in Anchorage, Alaska, and Houston, Texas. We are the Fossil Energy Laboratory. We've been stewarded by the Office of Fossil Energy for the last 22 years, and have a history that dates over 111 years, particularly at the Pittsburgh site, in doing fossil energy research. So where do we stand as the fossil laboratory in terms of how we can decarbonize? Well, if you look at our mission is how we drive innovation. We deliver solutions for an environmentally sustainable and prosperous energy future. And it's really at that crux of these two components, environmentally sustainable and a prosperous energy future, is where we sit. So we try to ensure that we have affordable, abundant, and reliable energy, while we can develop technologies to manage carbon across the full life cycle. And we have a big, robust life cycle assessment group at NETL. And so finally, how we can enable environmental sustainability for all Americans. So our vision is to be the premier laboratory with integrated technology solutions across the energy landscape. We do this across 5 technical core competencies and 1 in project management. And this is where really the meat of our national lab lies, in our Research and Innovation Center, with expertise in computational science and engineering, materials engineering, manufacturing, geological and environmental systems, energy conversion engineering, and strategic systems analysis and engineering, where life cycle assessment sits. We do a lot of management for the Department of Energy, because we are the only government-owned, government-operated laboratory of the 17. So we do project management, as you see on the bottom row, for offices in energy efficiency, EERE, and vehicles and buildings, geothermal, manufacturing, for the Office of Electricity, and for cybersecurity, energy security, and emergency response. So when I mention our vision is to be the premier integrated technology laboratory, it comes from this nature of us spanning across the entire energy system, certainly a big focus on both transportation and on the grid itself. Across the fossil energy space and advanced coal and carbon and natural gas and oil, we've historically had a long effort in carbon management. In particular, we have run a carbon capture, utilization, and storage program for the last 25 years, have advanced the technologies for where they are today, ready for wider scale deployment, as can be seen with a lot of industrial interest in the tax credit called 45Q, which provides an incentive, a tax incentive, for capturing CO2 and sequestering it. So just to get to the meat of the presentation today, really, in a very short time, I want to talk about those pathways to decarbonization. It's really probably the message of the day. And so our Strategic Systems Engineering and Analysis group took a look at some of the global energy scenarios analyses that exist today. Certainly, there's a lot of them that have come out recently for the U.S., specifically the National Academies of Science and Engineering and Medicine, Princeton, Stanford, the Energy Frontiers Initiative. Certainly there are a lot of pathways analyses focused on the U.S. We took a look at some of the global ones because we do live in a global market. Certainly IEA comes to the top of this list in terms of some of the scenarios of how to decarbonize our entire society across the globe. There's also a scenario from EIA, from BP's Energy Outlook, ExxonMobil, the Global Energy Assessment, as well as from the German Institute for Economic Research in Berlin. So one thing to keep in mind is these scenarios, they support judgments and decisions for the future. They illustrate a range of the different scenarios that might play out over the next, say, 30 years. They account for a lot of the trends and they monitor technology impacts on our pathway to decarbonization. But what they don't do is they don't predict or describe all possible scenarios, and perhaps there's a whole ensemble of scenarios that might be missed that result in a multiple optimal scenario when we consider a lot of different constraints on the energy system. And they don't really serve as a reliable indicator of likelihood of what might happen, but gives us a range of scenarios, and particularly an opportunity to take a look at the impacts of technology development, and then in fact that leads us to where investments in technology can make a greater impact on the scenario in the future. So when we look at some of these scenarios that were evaluated, we can kind of categorize them into some that fall into the business as usual category, where global annual emissions just keep rising. Economics are the key driver to those business as usual scenarios, but there are still some continued incentives for renewable energy and pointing toward electrification of the transportation sector. Flipping all the way over to the other side, what we might call visionary, are actually reducing emissions to reach the Paris Climate Agreement, either 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees from IPCC. They're all 2-degree decarbonization strategies. There's a lot of energy efficiency, demand response, in terms of behavior change as well, and wide-scale deployment of renewable and non-emitting sources, including nuclear, wind, solar, and other sources. And in the middle are some transitional ones where emissions kind of stay flat. There is electrification of the transportation sector. There is a hydrogen economy that comes out, and CCUS comes into play, as well as energy efficiency and demand response. But if we take a look at where some of the gaps might exist in the literature, and a lot of this isn't just for the global scenarios, it also is applicable to many of the U.S. Only scenarios. And when you get down to it, there is low temporal and geographical resolution. And the reason this is important, all you have to do is drive from our 2 eastern sites, from Pittsburgh to Morgantown or vice versa. You cross over from one public utility, fully regulated utility in West Virginia, to a deregulated generation utility on the electric side in Pennsylvania. And then same thing when you move across Pennsylvania, when you look at the use of energy, the portfolio, and even the drive to decarbonization may in fact have some geographical resolution across even just the state of Pennsylvania. But more fundamentally is how our grid is managed. If you just focus on electricity in the U.S. with the RTOs that manage the grid and manage the markets that drive the grid itself, those RTOs in fact have very heterogeneous looks in terms of the way the market is run and the trajectory. One doesn't have to go very far back in time to see ERCOT has a very different market than PJM. PJM being the RTO in the areas in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio, and over in toward the eastern seaboard. And one of the key drivers within the difference of those two markets is in the fact that PJM has a capacity market that pays energy producers to have the capacity to come online, where ERCOT does not, and we saw some ramifications of that little market difference come to play just last month. And so all of these other uncertainties are certainly no less important than the one I just focused on, and one is in reliability, again related to the ERCOT situation, fuel price uncertainties going out into the future, disruptive fuel price changes, system cost considerations across the system, and transferring from the say the transmission system we have today into what is going to be into the future, and many other things like market structure and the geopolitical climate. And then another component of it, it's not all inclusive of all the greenhouse gases and climate forcing gases emitted. And then what about the uncertainty in the hydrogen market and infrastructure and safety and things like that? So anyway, just to give you a landscape, there's still a lot of work to be done. That's the way I view it as director of NETL, and I know a lot of systems modelers view it as an opportunity for us to even get better. So if we look at some of the scenarios, and particularly the U.S.-related energy-related CO2 emissions across these 6 scenarios, you can see the wide difference in the scenarios looking at from the Biden Clean Energy Plan, the Paris Agreement in the 2025 realm, the Obama administration's mid-century strategy, and then you can see the EIA and BP scenarios in terms of reduction of CO2 in the end. And so again, I want to focus on the fact that a lot of these are pointing toward the end, and all the details in the middle are not quite clear. But if we take a look specifically at the IEA pathway, this is one individual pathway, again, not the entire ensemble of scenarios. We can see that it has to be a robust blend of technologies, from CCUS to improve technology performance, wide-scale electrification, and obviously the reason that one's so big is because transportation has millions, if not billions, of point sources today, and we need to drive toward electrification to consolidate some of those point sources. Additional renewables and bioenergy, hydrogen, and then the avoided demand in a growing population with growing demand today on the Earth. How do we develop a pathway that has, in fact, avoided demand even with growth in population? So this I think is representative of one of the pathways of how to get there, not with the resolution that I was just mentioning in terms of geographic resolution and even the temporal resolution. So if we dive into some specific technology areas, I'm going to focus a lot of the rest of the talk on CCUS very specifically. If we look at what we've been doing at NETL historically in the area of CCS and coal and natural gas for power, is do a lot of life cycle assessment and techno-economic analysis, and then how these build into the system, into a system-wide model of technology deployment to move down the pathway of decarbonization and technology deployment into the system. So historically, we've done a lot of baseline reports. You can look at the life cycle assessment baseline reports that NETL has done, some retrofit studies on how the cost of the retrofit, as well as the operating cost, so both capital and operating costs of retrofits, as well as some databases. And then another area in the CCUS technologies themselves, the materials, the membranes, the solvents, and sorbents, and how we can evaluate their techno-economic capacity for removing CO2 from flue gas streams. As we're moving into today and into the future, not only are we doing a lot of analysis around coal and natural gas, just like in the past, with some additional areas of emphasis in flexible operation and then how we move into market dispatch to really see the different scenarios play out under the existing market scenarios, and with the heterogeneity, both temporal and geographical heterogeneity in those markets as we're able to move forward. But then what's the role of direct air capture and doing some significant set of base cases for direct air capture and BECS, both technical economic assessment and life cycle assessment? Because if one asks why we need direct air capture, if you're not real familiar, there are certain components of our economy that just cannot be decarbonized by themselves. And so if we end up trying to get to a net zero economy in the United States by 2050, we must have some negative emissions technologies on the system to offset those areas of the economy that just simply cannot do without hydrocarbons. I mean, one of them simply may be, say, the transportation fuels for airplanes. When we look at air transportation, the density of the fuel is very valuable to have a hydrocarbon fuel. And so in the end, we make a decision which has the lowest life cycle cost and the lowest cost of full decarbonization, either biofuels for air transportation or other hydrocarbons that have some sort of carbon capture offset to provide a net pathway to decarbonization. And then finally, the industrial sector, specifically some of the high emitting components of the industrial sector, like cement production, hydrogen production, and we're doing a lot of work in the area of industrial air capture. And so now some of more details. I am myself an engineer and scientist, and I have to dive into the details because some of the technologies are just extremely exciting when we look at the approach to rapid technology commercialization, specifically in the area of CCUS. And so we have a whole portfolio of projects, some in-house at NETL and some with our research partners, one area at the low TRL level and testing new materials and processes with simulated emissions. Another area in small pilots and moving up to large pilots. And then finally, how can we move the technologies fully into the market? And so we're funding a number of FEED studies. These are front-end engineering design studies that would then be ready, nearly ready for construction. All of this is subject to our analysis and process modeling and techno-economic assessment and life cycle assessment, so we can continuously lower the cost of carbon capture. So some of the transformational CCS projects we have going on at NETL are in the area of natural gas, flue gas, and industrial capture, so lower CO2 percentages, not quite direct air capture percentages, but significantly lower than flue gas from coal. In the area of direct air capture, now we've moved from, say, 14% for coal, 7% for natural gas. Now we're at 4 parts per million for direct air capture. And so we've been developing some sorbent materials through computational screening, as well as using a hollow fiber bias sorbent for direct air capture as well, that was developed in-house. Then when we think about full decarbonization, we must have decarbonized hydrogen on the market. And so blue hydrogen is one of the options, certainly electrolysis using renewables, non-emitting sources, bringing in nuclear as well. But that just brings more electrons on the market. We have to have a bigger electric grid. There are certainly blue hydrogen pathways that would have net zero CO2 emissions and end up with a hydrogen fuel as a energy carrier that's not carrying the carbon along with it. And then under the Coal First program that we've had over the last couple of years, there's a project in using microwaves for assisting the sorbent regeneration to lower the energy penalty for regenerating the CO2 sorbent. And so we're taking a very integrated approach on how to commercialize CCUS projects. And so we have a carbon capture program as well as carbon storage, where we've spent a long time developing an understanding of the subsurface. And so our target is in 2025, having integrated CCS projects deployed. I think we're well on target for that, and moving into the transformational technologies by 2035. So we think this fits in quite well in terms of the pathways, even the IEA pathway, the deployment of CCUS into the future for deep decarbonization of the economy. When we look in the subsurface, very specifically, we've taken an approach over the last decade of dividing the country up into a number of regions and having regional partnerships and regional initiatives to characterize that subsurface and the ability to store large amounts of CO2. So now I'm going to mention an initiative at NETL called SAMI. This is the Science-Based Artificial Intelligence and Machine Learning Institute. We have an MOU with Carnegie Mellon and have been working in the area of artificial intelligence. And this institute at NETL is combining the strength of our computational scientists and subject matter experts specifically to target the interface between physics-based models with fundamental understanding that are built on the physics of the system, coupling that with the natural empiricism that often comes with artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms. And so we're trying to combine those two strengths and bring them together. The logo soup that we're showing are a number of different projects across the entire lab system, some of it with many other national lab and academic partners. A couple I'll point out in the bottom middle are CCSI2 or CCSI squared and IDEAS. These again are in partnership with Carnegie Mellon very specifically. And we think we are really onto something to bring together those technologies from the physics-based models up through artificial intelligence to machine learning. And so a couple of specific examples in the area of data management, data reporting platforms. Our energy data exchange that we built at NETL uses AI and machine learning as data come into this energy data exchange system. It's a system being used not only by fossil energy, but now being deployed more broadly across across the Department of Energy. And then as we look at ways that we can understand how to minimize the cost of carbon capture and develop a pathway of commercialization, CCSI and IDEAS, as I mentioned before, are using machine learning to accelerate moving from one scale to another and finding a solution to very complex models. And so we take the approach that we're taking at modeling is much like we do with the entire system, the energy system, as we like to be comprehensive and understand all of the different variables and scenarios. But when you do that and you think of the pathway for decarbonization and with the geographic and temporal resolution that I was mentioning before that is missing, we run into very large computational problems and need the world's best computational scientists to be able to make those problems tractable. And so to do that, we have to partner. And we're partnering with, we have 600 different partnerships across industry, academia, and the other national labs, 900 different research projects nationwide and some outside our U.S. borders. And that's the only way we can tackle these very complex problems and find ourselves on the right pathway to 2050. And so if you want to partner with NETL, we have a number of ways. I think we're going to share these slides. And so any of these tools within our toolbox of how to partner with NETL are available to many of the folks who will be listening today. So thank you very much. And I know I went more than 20 minutes, but maybe there's still some time for questions. Thanks, Anna.
Well, many of the questions, and there are a few questions that have come in. Thank you. So if you do have a question for Director Anderson, please go ahead and type that in. We have a couple of minutes. So a question came in that says, and it's about nuclear. It says, can or couldn't nuclear provide the energy that we need? And then we wouldn't have any of the environmental impacts. Can you talk a little bit about nuclear in relationship to some of the other feedstocks?
So nuclear has some great characteristics when it comes to baseline. But in fact, imagining a scenario in which nuclear we're trying to provide all the electricity, not energy, but electricity that we needed, then we would run into problems of load following. So nuclear does not do well when it comes to peaking and load following and things like that. Right now, most of that's done with natural gas across the country. And so we would run into issues if we didn't have storage. So it'd actually be the same, one of the same technical barriers that we see with variable and intermittent renewables is that we need large-scale energy storage on the system in order to get renewables well past say even 40%. We need a lot of storage on the grid. Nuclear run into the same issues.
Okay, so another question. With the new administration, have things changed, or how are you viewing things differently? And I know some of the answers about how you're using your technologies.
To be honest, I think this is one of the reasons why I wanted to mention that we've been doing CCS research for the last 25 years. Things have not changed that much. We've been on a trajectory of developing technologies to improve the performance and the CO2 footprint of fossil energy, which will stay on the grid. All of the scenarios include continued increased deployment of natural gas with CCUS in the future, and then over the next 20 and 30 years, seeing that possibly change, but we have trouble again predicting. And so anyway, I think the trajectory for what we've been focusing on hasn't really changed that much with the administration, but there's been an increased focus on how to get to the final goals. So the stated goals of being 2035 net zero power and 2050 net zero economy. There is a real pressing focus by the administration on developing the technology to get there and commercializing them. And so really pushing a lot of the technologies into the market.
So a follow-on question, actually from a different person, about SMR technologies. Wasn't the hope that SMR technologies could help with nuclear base, allowing more flexibility?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yes.
They can. Yes. Yeah. So the small modular reactors, can be more flexible than the large reactors that we operate today. But still, the response time that is needed, when you look at the ramp rates that we're seeing, say even in the evening in California, those ramp rates are getting to where they're even hard to follow by natural gas. And so, I think that it's still right on the edge that some of the ramp rates and being able to do the load following, it helps, but it's not all the way there.
So Director Anderson, thank you so much for your time today. We certainly appreciate your leadership. The lab is located in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and so we're always excited. I should say one of the offices of the lab is in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So always nice to have your leadership, and I appreciate your time today. Thank you also for our continued partnership around artificial intelligence and machine learning, which you mentioned, and looking forward to continued prosperity on that front. So thank you.
Yeah. Oh, my pleasure. And I'll answer Ken and Jill's questions later.
All right. Thank you.